Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we are reopening another chilling case hidden in the shadows of history. Dim the lights, stay close, and let us uncover the truth that others chose to forget. Every city has its ghost. But Boston's most haunting shadow is not a phantom from folklore, it is a mystery born in the heart of a modern city, under bright streetlights and quiet apartment corridors. Between 1962 and 1964, a string of brutal murders gripped the people of Massachusetts with fear. The newspapers called him the Boston Strangler. For 2 years, women were found lifeless in their own homes, violated, strangled, and left behind with strange details that would confuse investigators for decades. As sirens echoed through narrow Boston streets, no one knew who to trust. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted shut. People whispered in cafes and buses, wondering how a killer could enter so many homes without breaking in. The terror was not just about death, it was about invasion, the idea that evil could look ordinary, polite, maybe even familiar. When Albert DeSalvo confessed years later, it seemed like the nightmare had an ending. A man behind bars. A face to the fear. But from the very beginning, something felt off. His stories did not always match the evidence. Some details were too vague, others too perfect, like lines rehearsed from newspaper headlines. And when investigators listened closer, they realized that maybe, just maybe, DeSalvo was not the only one. 60 years later, this mystery refuses to rest. Modern forensics have connected DeSalvo's DNA to one victim, Mary Sullivan, the youngest and last in the series, but that single match opened more questions than it answered. If he killed Mary, what about the others? Could there have been multiple killers, or did the real Boston Strangler slip through history unnoticed? Today, the case has come back into the spotlight. Not because of new bodies, but because of new evidence, hidden recordings, rediscovered after decades, and voices from inside prison walls that tell a different version of the story. In these tapes, DeSalvo's tone shifts, his confidence cracks, and the illusion of certainty fades. It is as if the truth itself was strangled, buried beneath guilt, fame, and the desperate need for closure. So tonight, we are reopening the case that terrified a city. We will walk through the narrow streets of 1960s Boston, listen to the lost confessions, and follow the latest threads of investigation that might finally reveal what really happened behind those apartment doors. Was Albert DeSalvo truly the man the world feared, or was the real Boston Strangler someone else entirely? Lock your doors, dim the lights, and let us begin. Because some stories, especially the ones that never found their ending, refuse to stay silent. Decades after the terror faded from Boston streets, a new whisper has started to circulate that the man everyone believed was the Boston Strangler may not have acted alone, or may not have been the Strangler at all. In early 2025, a man from Springfield, Massachusetts, came forward claiming he possessed information that could change everything investigators thought they knew. He handed over what he described as evidence pointing to a different suspect, someone whose name had barely been mentioned in the original investigation. The Boston police did not dismiss him. Instead, they quietly reopened parts of the old case file, re-examining reports and photographs that had gathered dust for 60 years. The details of his evidence remain confidential, but sources close to the department say it includes letters, recordings, and an old item recovered from an apartment near one of the crime scenes. If true, it could suggest that Albert DeSalvo was not working alone, or perhaps had nothing to do with several of the killings attributed to him. This is not the first time doubt has crept in. Even back in the 1960s, detectives noticed inconsistencies. Some victims were young, others elderly. Some homes were ransacked. Others were left perfectly neat. The killer's methods shifted from one case to the next, different knots, different ligatures, even different behaviors. That is not how most serial offenders operate. It felt less like one signature, and more like several overlapping hands. And that is where the new lead becomes so unsettling. If a second man was involved, it would explain the conflicting details. It would mean that the Boston Strangler was not a single figure haunting the city, but a pattern created by chaos, multiple predators moving through the same streets, feeding on the same fear. Reporters have speculated whether this new suspect could have been part of DeSalvo's social circle, or even someone who influenced him to confess. Some investigators from the original task force now admit they always doubted DeSalvo's story. He craved attention. He wanted recognition even if it was for something monstrous. A few believe he was manipulated, perhaps coached by another inmate, to take responsibility for crimes he did not commit. The Springfield tip has reignited those questions. Could the real Strangler have hidden behind DeSalvo's confession all along? And if so, who was he? A neighbor, a co-worker, a man whose name was buried in the thousands of forgotten pages from 1960s police archives? As the new evidence is reviewed, experts warn not to expect simple answers. But one thing is clear, the legend of the Boston Strangler is no longer settled history. It is alive again, shifting, mutating, demanding to be re-examined. Because when a case this dark refuses to die, it is usually because the truth has not been fully told. When the Boston police first confirmed they were reviewing the old files again, it did not make front-page news. There was no press conference, no flashing lights. Just a short statement that the department was evaluating new information related to the historic Boston Strangler case. But to anyone who has followed this mystery, those few words carried the weight of a thunderclap. After 60 years, the most infamous series of murders in Massachusetts history might not be over. Inside the police archives, boxes once sealed with fading tape are being reopened. Photographs marked evidence are laid out again under the cold light of modern labs. Fibers, fingerprints, and hair samples collected decades before DNA analysis existed are now being tested with technology that did not even exist in the 1960s. What was once speculation can now be measured. What was invisible can now be seen. For detectives working on the review, this is not just about solving a cold case, it is about correcting the record. The official story has always been uneasy. One man, Albert DeSalvo, confessed to the killings, but the science did not support all of his claims. And yet, for decades, the case remained closed in the public mind. People wanted a villain, and DeSalvo was convenient. But behind the scenes, police never fully shut the file. It sat open, technically unsolved, waiting for the day new tools could speak for the victims who could not. Now, that day has come. According to insiders, the new investigation is being handled quietly by a small team of detectives and forensic experts, working from the cold case division. Their task is not simple: to reassemble a puzzle scattered across time. Many of the original officers are long gone, evidence chains were broken, and entire sections of documentation were lost or destroyed. But the determination remains. Families of the victims, too, are watching closely. Some have grown old waiting for justice. Others have passed away still unsure who really killed their loved ones. For them, this new review is not just an academic exercise, it is the last chance for closure. "We just want the truth," one surviving relative said in a local interview. "Even if it is not what we expected. And the truth may still be buried in plain sight." Police sources suggest that the Springfield evidence, along with the rediscovered confession tapes, are being analyzed together for the first time. If connections emerge, a fingerprint, a name, even a pattern, it could rewrite one of America's most studied serial cases. Still, no one inside the department is making promises. The phrase "ongoing investigation" is the only official comment. But to the people who remember the fear that once gripped this city, that phrase means hope, and maybe, after all these years, an ending. Because some doors in Boston were never truly closed. They were just waiting to be unlocked again. In the fall of 2025, a discovery shook the old legends surrounding the Boston Strangler. Hidden for decades in a private collection of legal archives, a series of forgotten audio tapes surfaced: more than 16 hours of recorded interviews with Albert DeSalvo himself. These were not police interrogations. They were personal sessions, taped quietly inside prison walls, capturing the man behind the myth in his own words. The recordings were raw, unfiltered, and filled with contradictions that blurred the line between truth and performance. The tapes became the foundation of a new documentary, The Boston Strangler: Unheard Confession. When excerpts were released to the public, listeners expected a cold-blooded killer calmly describing his crimes. What they heard instead was something else: a restless man who shifted his tone constantly, bragging one moment, then backtracking the next. His voice carried both pride and fear, sometimes claiming memories that did not exist, sometimes forgetting details that should have burned into his mind forever. In one portion, DeSalvo described entering an apartment with a key. Though investigators confirmed that particular victim's door showed no signs of entry, nor was there any reason she would have let him in. In another, he mentioned objects that were never found at any crime scene. The more he spoke, the less it sounded like a confession, and more like a story being built from pieces of rumor and newspaper clippings. Experts who reviewed the audio say it raises one chilling question. Was DeSalvo confessing to something he did not do? Psychologists who study false confessions believe his motives could have been complex. Some think he was manipulated, possibly by another inmate who coached him for personal gain. Others believe he wanted recognition, to become someone in a world where he had always been invisible. If the world remembers you, one criminologist remarked, you never truly disappear. And for DeSalvo, that might have been the point. But the recordings also hint at a darker truth. Between his fragmented statements, there are moments of silence, long, tense pauses where he seems unsure or afraid. At times, he whispers names that do not appear in any case file. When asked about accomplices, his responses are vague, like someone afraid of saying too much. Those moments have become the focus of renewed investigation. For decades, the image of the Boston Strangler was fixed: one man, one monster, one confession. But these tapes, rediscovered in a dusty legal vault and now analyzed with digital clarity, may change that forever. They do not just reopen the debate over guilt or innocence. They expose how fragile the truth becomes when built on fear, pressure, and the need for closure. Because in those trembling words from a prison cell, we may finally hear not the voice of a killer but the echo of a man caught inside a story far larger and far darker than anyone ever realized. When the Boston Strangler Unheard Confession premiered in October 2025, viewers did not expect revelations, they expected closure. Instead, they were met with unease. The documentary peeled back the curtain on a case that most people believed had been solved long ago, and what it revealed was a tangled web of mistakes, pressure, and manipulation that might have changed the course of history. The film opened with grainy black and white footage of 1960s Boston narrow streets, neon lights, and the faces of frightened women glancing over their shoulders. Then came the voice, Albert DeSalvo's confession, echoing through time, uneven and uncertain. I remember her. I think it was a scarf, he murmured, his tone flickering between confidence and confusion. Each word was accompanied by images of evidence: the ligature knots, the overturned furniture, the police sketches pinned on old corkboards. But for every detail that fit, another did not. As the documentary unfolded, experts dissected those recordings line by line. Forensic psychologists, retired detectives, and journalists all pointed out the same inconsistencies: wrong apartment layouts, incorrect victim names, timelines that simply did not exist. Yet the more the filmmakers questioned the confession, the more compelling it became. Why would anyone invent such horror, and who benefited from his confession in the first place? One former investigator interviewed in the film revealed that, in the 1960s, the city was desperate for answers. The media had turned the Boston Strangler into a monster that haunted every headline. Public panic was spreading, and officials needed a resolution. When DeSalvo confessed, the relief was immediate: finally, someone to blame. But that relief, the documentary suggests, may have come at the cost of truth. The film also introduces new digital analysis of DeSalvo's speech patterns. Voice stress experts found moments where his tone indicated uncertainty or possible fabrication. During specific confessions, physiological signs recorded: breathing rates, stammers, and tonal drops suggested discomfort, as though he were trying to recall something that had never really happened. He is performing, one analyst said. He is not remembering, he is acting. Even more haunting were the interviews with surviving relatives of the victims. Some had grown up believing DeSalvo was the killer. Others never accepted it. Watching the documentary, their faces reflected a mix of sorrow and anger. We have been told one story for 60 years, said the niece of one victim. Now I am not sure if we have ever known the truth. By the time the credits rolled, it was clear the film was not meant to provide answers, it was meant to reopen wounds. In shining new light on those forgotten tapes, Unheard Confession did what few documentaries manage to do. It turned a cold case back into a living mystery. Because sometimes the past does not whisper, it screams, demanding to be heard again. As the world listened to Albert DeSalvo's voice through those rediscovered tapes, a disturbing question began to echo louder than any confession. What if the wrong man took the blame? For decades, DeSalvo has been remembered as the Boston Strangler, a label that stuck not because of hard evidence, but because of timing, convenience, and public relief. In 1964, the city needed closure. Fear had consumed Boston for nearly 2 years, and the people wanted a name, a face, someone to blame. When DeSalvo confessed, exhausted detectives and terrified residents finally exhaled. But relief is not the same as truth, and the cracks in that truth have only deepened with time. When investigators revisited DeSalvo's original interviews, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. He described rooms that did not exist, victims who did not match, and even confessed to murders that occurred while he was provably elsewhere. The way he talked about the scenes, general, imprecise, filled with second-hand details, suggested he would read about the crimes in the papers rather than witness them. Many of his memories matched the exact phrasing used in 1960s headlines. Even more troubling was how he confessed. DeSalvo was not arrested for murder. He was initially caught for a string of sexual assaults known as the Measuring Man and Green Man cases. It was only after meeting another inmate, George Nasser, a clever, manipulative career criminal, that DeSalvo began to remember being the Strangler. Some believe Nasser fed him information, possibly hoping for a deal or fame of his own. Others think DeSalvo, desperate for recognition, simply embraced the role. He wanted to be important, said one psychiatrist. If he could not be remembered for good, he would settle for infamy. The inconsistencies did not end there. The knots used to strangle the victims were tied in several different ways, an odd detail for a single killer with a supposed signature. The victims ranged from teenagers to elderly women, killed with scarves, stockings, even bare hands. Behavioral profilers have since noted that this diversity does not fit the pattern of one serial offender. Fits multiple. When modern analysts compared DeSalvo's known behaviors to the Strangler's profile, the mismatch was striking. DeSalvo's assaults were opportunistic and non-lethal. The Strangler's crimes were ritualistic, methodical, and deeply personal. He was not the type, one retired FBI agent said bluntly. He was a predator, yes, but not that predator. And yet, the legend endures. Because in the public's mind, the name Boston Strangler and the face of Albert DeSalvo are forever linked, proof of how easily narrative can eclipse fact. But if he did not kill them all, who did? That question hangs over the city like a chill. Because once you start doubting the confession, the entire story unravels. And what is left is a haunting thought. The real killer or killers may have been walking free all along. Every serial case tells a story, but the story told by the Boston Strangler murders never made sense. Not completely. The victims were too different, the methods too inconsistent, the signatures too unstable. From the beginning, even veteran investigators whispered the same thing behind closed doors: it does not look like one man. Between 1962 and 1964, 11 women were killed, maybe 13 depending on which files you read. They ranged from 19 to 85 years old. Some were strangled with nylon stockings, others with scarves, belts, or even their bare hands. Some apartments were ransacked. Others were spotless. One scene suggested rage. Another looked almost staged. The inconsistencies were not subtle, they were glaring. Criminal profilers today describe this as a behavioral fracture. Most serial offenders follow a pattern that grows stronger over time, a ritual, a rhythm. But in the Boston case, that rhythm was broken, shifting wildly from victim to victim. It is as if you are looking at several composers writing different movements of the same symphony, one profiler explained in the 2025 documentary. You can hear the same notes, but the tempo, tone, and emotion keep changing. That theory, multiple killers, is not new. In fact, even in the 1960s, some detectives on the task force believed they were chasing more than one man. But the theory faded after DeSalvo's confession, buried under the relief of having a culprit to display. It was easier to believe in a single monster than in the terrifying possibility of several. Recent forensic reviews have breathed life back into that idea. Some of the murders bear hallmarks of different psychological profiles, one methodical and organized, another impulsive and erratic. Some show clear evidence of sexual motivation. Others do not. And when investigators compared old crime scene photos under modern analysis, small but telling differences emerged: different knots, different levels of planning, even differences in how the killer handled post-crime details like covering the body or leaving items behind. What if, experts now ask, the Boston Strangler was never one man at all but a label created by the media? A narrative that blurred together a series of unrelated killings under one terrifying name? It is possible that one or two of the murders were the work of a true serial offender, while others were crimes of opportunity that simply fit the pattern of fear. Once the name Strangler hit the headlines, every new victim seemed to confirm the myth. For the public, that myth was easier to accept. A single killer could be caught. The idea of multiple murderers of a city infested with shadows was far more frightening. So the legend narrowed, and DeSalvo became the face of a collective nightmare. But today, as new investigators study the files again, that collective nightmare may turn out to be closer to reality. Because maybe the Boston Strangler was not a man. Maybe he was an idea, a mask worn by several monsters, moving through the same city, hunting in the same dark. When DNA testing finally entered the picture, many hoped it would silence the debate once and for all. Science, after all, does not lie, or so people thought. But when the results came back, the truth was not as simple as headlines made it seem. In 2013, investigators used modern genetic analysis to examine evidence from the murder of Mary Sullivan, the last known victim attributed to the Boston Strangler. Her case had always stood out not only for its brutality, but because physical samples had survived long enough to be tested decades later. A semen stain found on her blanket was compared to the Y chromosome of a male relative of Albert DeSalvo. The result was a match. It seemed, at first, like the ultimate confirmation science had finally spoken and DeSalvo was guilty. But forensic truth often comes with fine print. The DNA proved DeSalvo's presence at one crime scene, not all of them. And that is where the certainty began to unravel. Forensic experts explained that while this evidence tied him directly to Sullivan's murder, it said nothing about the 10 or more women who died before her. Their cases had no surviving biological evidence to test. The samples had degraded, been lost, or never collected properly. That single match became both a revelation and a trap. Prosecutors, journalists, and the public latched onto it, framing DeSalvo as the final answer. But scientists quietly cautioned against overreach. DNA does not connect him to a pattern, one criminologist noted. It connects him to one person, and that is all we can prove. To make matters worse, the reliability of old evidence has its limits. Samples stored for decades can be contaminated by air, temperature, or human handling. Even modern labs approach half-century-old materials with extreme caution. And as technology evolves, so does the interpretation. What was impossible to detect in 1990 can be examined in 2025, but it does not always make the picture clearer. Sometimes, it only reveals how much we have lost. The Sullivan DNA link remains the most concrete piece of proof in the entire case. Yet even that proof raises questions. If DeSalvo truly killed her, why did her murder differ so drastically from earlier ones? Why was her body left posed differently, with none of the distinct ritual elements seen before? Was he copying a pattern or concluding it? Some investigators now believe Sullivan's death may have been a copycat crime, staged to resemble the Strangler's work. Modern forensics has advanced beyond what 1960s investigators could imagine, but even science can't fill in every blank. Time erases. Evidence decays. Memories fade. And when what is left is only partial truth, the story remains suspended between certainty and doubt. So yes, DNA told us that Albert DeSalvo was there once. But it did not tell us everything. It did not tell us why. And until it does, the Boston Strangler case will remain exactly what it has always been: one part science, one part shadow. For years, the story of the Boston Strangler was buried under layers of dust and half-remembered fairy tale. People believed they already understood. But in 2024 and 2025, something shifted. Suddenly, the old headlines returned. The podcasts, the documentaries, the late-night talk segments all began asking the same question again: what if we got it wrong? It started quietly. A local investigative journalist from Boston released a feature about the rediscovered audio tapes, the unheard confessions of Albert DeSalvo. Within weeks, the story spread nationwide. Streaming platforms picked it up. True crime forums reignited decades-old debates. People who were not even born when the murders happened were now watching, commenting, dissecting every inconsistency in DeSalvo's words. For a new generation, the Boston Strangler was not ancient history, it was an active mystery. Soon, Oxygen True Crime announced its full-length documentary series, followed by competing projects from Netflix and Hulu, each promising to uncover the truth behind the myth. Cameras returned to Boston's old neighborhoods. Former detectives and surviving relatives sat under studio lights, reliving memories they would try to forget. And for the first time in decades, the victims, the women whose names had been overshadowed by the killer's legend, began to take center stage. Their faces filled the screen. Mary Sullivan, Patricia Bissett, Ida Erga, Beverly Simmons. They were teachers, nurses, mothers, daughters, people who had dreams and routines before terror took over. Hearing their stories again reminded viewers that this was not just about crime. It was about human lives interrupted. The media, once obsessed with the killer's psychology, finally began to focus on the victim's humanity. But renewed attention also brought tension. Families who had long accepted DeSalvo's guilt were now facing uncertainty all over again. Some expressed anger, saying the documentaries were reopening wounds for profit. Others felt relief that someone still cared enough to ask hard questions. "It is painful," one relative admitted during an interview, "but silence is worse." The new coverage also reignited academic debate. Criminologists and forensic historians began publishing new papers, reinterpreting police behavior and exploring the role of 1960s social pressure in forcing confessions. On social media, armchair detectives pored over vintage photos and maps, theorizing about potential copycats or accomplices. The digital age had transformed an old crime spree into a collective investigation, global, constant, and louder than ever before. And yet, amid all the noise, one truth became clear: people still cared. Even after 60 years, the mystery of the Boston Strangler refused to die. Every new article, every interview, every late-night discussion kept the case alive, not just in memory but in momentum. In the end, the media did not just resurrect a story, it reignited a pursuit. Because when history whispers that something does not add up, there will always be someone willing to listen, to dig deeper, to ask again who really strangled Boston. For most crimes, time brings closure. Files are sealed, memories fade, and the headlines move on. But in Boston, the Strangler case still lingers like fog over the Charles River that never lifts. Officially, the city does not call it a cold case. Unofficially, it is one of the oldest open wounds in American criminal history. The Boston Police Department has never declared the investigation fully closed. Even after Albert DeSalvo's confession, even after his DNA matched evidence from Mary Sullivan's murder, the official classification remained unsolved pending further evidence. It is a quiet acknowledgement that something about the story never quite added up. Inside the department's archives, the boxes marked Strangler have not been returned to long-term storage. They sit within reach of investigators from the cold case unit, who occasionally pull them out when new technology, new tips, or new funding appears. Over the years, the case has moved between hands, from detectives who once walked those same streets in the 1960s, to young forensic analysts now armed with tools their predecessors could never dream of. And the work continues. Each decade brings a fresh wave of hope that science will catch up with history. In the early 2000s, it was early DNA testing. In the 2010s, genetic genealogy. And by the 2020s, forensic AI capable of cross-referencing old fingerprints and partial profiles across thousands of databases. Yet even with this arsenal of modern technology, no definitive connection has been made to the earlier victims. The investigation now operates more like an ongoing audit of history. Detectives review evidence logs, trace the chain of custody of missing items, and verify whether certain statements were ever recorded accurately. Some pieces of evidence have vanished, others were mislabeled. A few were only rediscovered recently, buried in unrelated case files. Each small recovery adds another fragment to the puzzle. For the families of the victims, that persistence matters. They know the odds are slim, but every time an investigator revisits a detail or runs a new test, It feels like their loved one's name is spoken again, remembered, not forgotten. We are not asking for miracles, one relative said during a 2024 interview. We just want the truth before we are gone. To the police, keeping the file open is both duty and legacy. It is a reminder that even the most famous confessions deserve scrutiny, and that every case, no matter how old, still belongs to someone. And so, the story remains suspended between past and present, a case not quite cold, not quite solved. The files may yellow with age, but the investigation breathes on quietly, waiting for a breakthrough that may come tomorrow or never at all. Because in Boston, the Strangler is not just history, he is unfinished business. In modern forensics, time is the enemy. Every year that passes eats away at evidence, fibers decay. Paper yellows, biological traces break down into unreadable fragments. But in the Boston Strangler case, time has also become an unexpected ally. The very science that did not exist in the 1960s is now rewriting what is possible. Over the past decade, DNA technology has advanced far beyond simple matching. Forensic genealogy, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer, can now build entire family trees from microscopic samples. Even a few preserved skin cells, a touch on a doorknob, a drop of saliva absorbed into old fabric, could open new paths that once seemed impossible. That is why Boston investigators have not given up. Cold case detectives have quietly begun reviewing old evidence for any material suitable for retesting. Even partial genetic profiles, if recovered, can be run through genealogical databases that map out connections across generations. If the real Strangler left behind even a trace of himself, a fingerprint, a flake of skin, a hair follicle, today's technology could expose him. The challenge, of course, is preservation. Many of the original evidence kits were handled using outdated methods, stored in paper envelopes or cardboard boxes, often without temperature control. Some were even moved between facilities during renovations, risking contamination. To extract usable DNA from such material requires extraordinary care and a bit of luck. Scientists working with the Boston Police Crime Lab describe the process as like resurrecting a ghost. In 2025, several universities in Massachusetts began offering assistance, providing high-resolution scanners, digital microscopy, and advanced DNA sequencing equipment capable of working with degraded samples. The hope is to locate molecular traces from victims other than Mary Sullivan, anything that might link or exclude DeSalvo once and for all. If multiple genetic profiles appear across different crime scenes, it would support the long-suspected theory that more than one killer operated during those years. Even beyond DNA, new technologies offer possibilities. Artificial intelligence can now reconstruct crime scene environments from old photographs, estimating body positions, distances, and even lighting to re-evaluate how the killer may have entered or exited a room. Machine learning models can cross-reference linguistic patterns in DeSalvo's statements with psychological profiles from other serial offenders, measuring the likelihood that his confession matched real memory versus fabrication. Still, experts caution that science cannot solve everything. Evidence can tell us who was there, one forensic analyst explained, but not always why they were there or what truly happened. The Boston Strangler investigation sits precisely at that intersection between fact and motive, data and doubt. Yet hope remains. Every new discovery in forensic technology brings the possibility that one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in America could finally yield an answer. Maybe it won't be today or next year. But time, once the Strangler's greatest shield, may one day become the force that unmasks him. Because in the end, science never sleeps and neither does the truth. 60 years have passed since the terror first gripped Boston, yet the story of the Strangler continues to breathe not as a solved crime, but as a living, shifting mystery. The case has outlived its witnesses, its detectives, and even its supposed killer. And still, the question remains, who was the real Boston Strangler? Perhaps that is why the case endures. It is not just a series of murders, it is a mirror reflecting our collective need for certainty in the face of chaos. When DeSalvo confessed, the city could finally sleep again. The monster had a name and fear could be contained. But as time peeled away the layers of that confession, people began to see the cracks, the inconsistencies, the manipulation, the desperation for closure that might have blinded justice itself. The Boston Strangler has since evolved from a man into a myth, a dark legend that belongs as much to psychology and culture as to crime. Writers, filmmakers, and historians continue to return to it, each time uncovering a new version of the truth. Some see it as a cautionary tale about media hysteria, others as a failure of justice, and a few as a tragic portrait of a man who confessed to something he did not fully understand. But beneath all the theories, one thing is constant: the human cost. The victims' names Mary Sullivan, Beverly Simmons, Ida Erga, Patricia Bissett, Evelyn Corbin, and others still echo through Boston's memory. They were not symbols. They were lives. And in every retelling, in every re-examination, the story shifts away from the killer and back toward them, the women who never saw justice served. For investigators, the case has become both obsession and burden. Each generation of detectives inherits the same files, the same unanswered questions, the same ghosts. They know the odds are slim, but they keep trying. You do not close something like this, one modern investigator said. You just keep listening, waiting for it to speak again. And sometimes it does. A new lead. A forgotten fingerprint. A voice on an old tape that sounds just a little different than before. These fragments, scattered across decades, keep the case alive like embers refusing to die out. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Boston Strangler, not the murders themselves, but the mystery they left behind. A mystery that challenges science, faith, and memory, that reminds us how fragile the truth can be when fear takes control. So the story endures, whispering through time, waiting for the day someone finally connects every thread. Until then, Boston remains haunted not by a man in the shadows, but by a single unanswered question that has outlasted generations. Was Albert DeSalvo the killer? Or just the ghost of another man's crime? Whatever the answer, the Boston Strangler will never fully rest, not until the truth finally does. And so, after 6 decades, the legend of the Boston Strangler remains unsolved, not because the evidence is gone, but because the truth itself has become tangled in time. Every confession, every doubt, every rediscovered tape leads us closer, yet somehow never all the way there. What began as a hunt for a killer has become something larger, a haunting study of fear, justice, and the human need to know. Boston has changed. The streets are brighter now, the city louder, faster, alive in a way the 1960s could never imagine. Yet sometimes, when the night falls quiet and the wind moves through those old brick alleys, you can almost feel it, the weight of unanswered questions. Somewhere in those shadows lies the real story, waiting for one more clue, one more voice brave enough to speak. Maybe the Boston Strangler was one man. Maybe he was many. Maybe he was the city's reflection, a reminder of how fragile safety can be, and how easily truth can slip away when fear takes its place. But one thing is certain: the victims deserve to be remembered not as headlines, but as people, and their story deserves to be told until the final piece of this mystery is found. Thank you for joining me tonight, and for walking through the echoes of Boston's darkest chapter. If you are watching this from somewhere quiet, take a moment to look around, lock your doors, dim the lights, and remember, history does not always stay buried. I will see you in the next episode, where another unsolved case waits in the dark, and together, we will try once more to bring light to the shadows. Good night, and stay curious.